Hello YouTube and welcome to part 3 in our Gravis Captain painting series. We're going to be working today on both the cape and the power sword. It might seem like a little strange to pair those two things together, but basically I wanted to use the same colour for both of those so that I could create a big colour pop down one side of the miniature. And with that in mind, it made sense to show you how to paint both of them at the same time. Perhaps if I was working this up off camera completely, I wouldn't necessarily do both of those pieces at the same time, but we're going to show you that today. So let's get down to down cam, no messing around today. Let's show you how to blend a nice green cape and do some black highlighting and a cool little different way of painting a power sword as well. Hope you enjoy, see you in the down cam. Alright, so making a start here, we're going to be using Boreal Green, Solid Black and Dragon White. The latter two from Reaper, the four from Scale 75. This is going to form the majority of our workup for all of these green areas. Starting out, applying, so this is very thin paint, but we're applying it quite liberally. And the plan here is just to start to establish which parts of the cape are going to be green and which parts of the cape are going to be black, because I want this kind of fade between the two colours. And so this is kind of a pre-sketch, I guess. That's the easiest way to look at it. We're just moving around that and marking out those areas. And then what you're going to start to see me do from there is just go back in then and strengthen those colours. And I'm paying particular attention to where I'm going to be placing my highlights eventually, to make sure that in the areas where the highlights are going to be, I've got full colour saturation. I feel like that's really important to sort of prevent that kind of pasty, rough, almost chalk-like texture. You can see as I'm focusing back in, adding multiple coats, those coats are going on in areas that are already starting to get solid. Paying particular attention to that edge. And that's probably going to be the brightest part of the cape, so it does need a little bit of extra attention. Now as we get onto the sword, you see I'm going to be starting to use those directional strokes off the side of the brush. And we're really going to be focusing here on trying to push the paint in the direction that we want the light to build. You see me just going around now and strengthening up everything that I've already done. Strengthening more. Quickly sketching in the purity seals. That's for later, but I just wanted to remind myself that I was planning to do them green. And there you are, we've got some nice strong Boreal green now, blending out from black. And now we'll switch to a black glaze. This is a heavy black glaze, and I'm going to use this to start to mark the opposite sides of those sections, start to blend back down towards the black basically. Again, still pretty sketchy at this stage, I'm not really trying to be overly clean with it. It's mainly just about making decisions on where we're placing shades, where we're placing highlights. Coming back up to the sword now, same thing, moving away, using those directional brush strokes, moving away from the green highlight. That helps to give that nice transitional blend between those two colours. Now we'll start to reinforce that a bit. can see that blend now starting to look a lot smoother. I'll focus back down on the cape a bit more now and do more of the same. This is essentially the same process I was just carrying out on the sword, just deciding where those transitions need to go and just starting to smooth them in. I've got a thinner glaze here now, which just again helps with the smoothness of the transition. Start with a thick glaze to map stuff in, then switch down to a thinner glaze. Now we're adding some lightness. You can see the colour is quite bright that we're moving up to, but we're going to keep it thin so it will glaze in quite neatly. Again, looking for highlight placement first of all, deciding where we want the highlights to live. Then once we know where they live, then we can start to just sketch in any sort of transitions. Same thing, getting up onto the sword, move up a little so that we're not highlighting in the same area that we just were before. Little edge highlight at this point. It's always good to start bringing this edge highlight in fairly early, otherwise the final really bright edge highlight can look a bit sudden. And again, just lots of going over that now, adding to the same thing. Continuing to build up and strengthen those highlights. As you can see, it's starting to get quite bright now, but it's staying fairly smooth. Brightening up again now, focusing more towards the tip and the base of the sword. Again, continue to strengthen those highlights at the same time. Getting a little finer now on the highlights on the front of the cape. Concentrating on those edge highlights. You'll notice here as I've been applying this as well, I'm ignoring this decoration at the start of the cape. I'm just going to paint that in using the same non-metallic technique as the rest of the non-metallic gold on the piece. So I decided to just kind of ignore it at this stage and then paint it out black once I'd finished the cape, and then add the gold non-metallic work up to it. You can see all we're doing now is continuing to go around and just get brighter and brighter, and as we get brighter to shrink those highlights. You're very used to this process, whether it's me that you watch painting regularly or most other painting tutorials. It's just fairly common practice to just see as those highlights get lighter, they also shrink. We're onto a very, very bright highlight now, which is very thin at the same time, and this is going to be as we start to really punch towards the brighter end of the highlights on these green areas now. You can see how thin my paint is by how it pulls there slightly, and so I have to drag it down a little further. I think what I actually did there was not reload my brush, but actually dry it off a little bit on some tissue, just to help with this edge highlight. And we'll scoot around now and do that to the rest of the miniature. Strengthen up those highlights as we go, keep getting them brighter and brighter and brighter. Remember, as you add highlights, you don't necessarily have to add just brighter highlights in the sense of adding a lighter colour. If you're using transparent paint, you can also brighten highlights just by adding additional layers. So knowing when to add more coverage versus when to add more bright paint into the mix, it can take a bit of learning and getting used to. But once you kind of get your head around that, it's going to enable you to just have a lot more control when you're highlighting. apologies for the bit of off camera there. I think that was just an area where I really had to get it stable, and unfortunately once I got it settled in place I didn't realise I was off camera until I looked up. There we are. So what I'm actually doing here is a Boreal green glaze. This is just pure Boreal green, I believe. Oh no, it's black, okay. Just going through with black, readjusting. So this is a much heavier black now, just to tidy up the areas where the black's got a bit messy. And then we're starting to stipple in this this detail now onto the sword. Just straight off the tip of the brush, little dots. And this is to give that sort of bubbly, glowing, magical, sparkly effect that I've decided to do for this power sword. Not typical of how I do power swords, but I wanted to do something a bit different for this video series. Little sparkly dots. And we'll continue to brighten and reinforce those as we go. Again, being more scarce and shrinking them as they get brighter. So that the ones that are the most numerous or the largest are the duller ones, and the ones that are the brightest are smaller, less numerous in quantity. Same again on the other side of the blade. Brighter still. Continue those edge highlights as well. It's all starting to look really nice at this point. Okay, so now we're into that very thin Boreal green glaze. This is pure Boreal green, but it's just extremely thin. And I'm just going to run this over everything just to start filtering. What I'm also going to do is filter over the gold on the pommel and the quillons of the sword to start to give a bit of an OSL. At one point I did decide to take that OSL actually down onto the arm plates as well, but I didn't like it, so I took it back out. Very thin black glaze now. Again, just to start to work on some transitions. There it goes, starting to push up into those shades again. Because we added that all over Boreal green glaze, all it meant was just that some of the blacks on the sword were no longer true black. So I did just want to go back in and just pull down some of the areas so that we still had some areas of true black. Alright, so now that we've seen how we're doing all of those light green areas and the various bits of blending up, they're not 100% finished, but at this stage I'm now going to move on to the black for the cape. This highlight method that I'm about to show you for the cape, I will give just a little note that between episodes I will use this exact same highlight method to highlight the rest of the black areas on the miniature, but I am just going to show it on the cape because it is quite time consuming and I didn't really want to work through a whole bunch of stuff that's going to take a really long time just to show you the same thing. So we'll shoot back down to the down cam now and let's take a look at highlighting the back of that cape and how we're going to do that. Okay, starting out then with Married Blue. It's a medium blue with a good amount of white filler in it, which is why I like it for highlighting black. You can mix it straight into black to make greys, which is what we're going to do. Starting out with about a 50-50, we're just going to, same as we did on the front of the cloak, carefully paint on where we want our initial highlights first of all. Just mark out those areas, map them in. And then we'll start glazing in with the same colour now, just blending towards them, using those directional strokes, pushing the glaze from the black area in towards that grey highlight to create a nice point of transition. Brush strokes always running from the black into the grey. That's really the important thing. Just continue to fortify those glazes now, adding more and more layers, continuing the same thing. Just keep strengthening up those transitions so they look smoother and smoother as we go. And that's after the first layer of just one type of grey. You can see it's already starting to form a nice little sweep of blended transitions. Now we'll go to a black glaze, go back down in the opposite direction now. Start to hit those shadows, blend from the greys into the blacks. Continuing to just strengthen those up again as we did when we were highlighting up. Exactly the same process. Just keep pushing those glazes darker and darker so that you get a nice staggered, faded blend from dark to light. Now adding some more of that married blue into our black. This gets us to something similar to a kind of Space Wolves grey. If you were using Citadel paints, I guess you would start with the dark grey, the name escapes me, and then go into a Space Wolves grey. Mechanicus Standard grey, that's the dark one I'm thinking of. Evidence as to how little I use Citadel paints these days. You can see now we're just doing exactly the same thing, just neatly picking the highlight spots and starting to add some of this medium grey to those, just as we did when we were doing the dark grey. Some nice bands of that medium grey. And then we're going to grab our glaze again, and we're going to start to glaze into it. Exactly the same process as previous, just with a lighter colour in a thinner area. Now these next few stages, because they're so small, we're just going to start getting all of this highlighted now, these last few sections of highlight in one sort of continuous movement. I think I've demonstrated the process to you now, so you sort of know what I'm doing. Paint in the exact spot where I want the highlight and then feather into it using glazes. So we're just going to do a few stages now towards the bottom of the cape. My figuring being that any light source that's above the piece would probably block a lot of light getting towards the top of the cape, so there wants to be fewer highlights up there. But down the bottom the light would be able to move past the things like the backpack and the shoulder pads, and so that light would be able to hit the bottom of the cape a bit more. You will see in the next video there is an effect that's going to go over this as well, so I'm not really looking for something that's exact at this stage. Now getting really bright, but also really thin. I wanted to take a second to show you how thin the paint is here. This is just our last couple of highlights. I think there's one more, maybe two more after this, but the last one is an absolute pinpoint highlight. Continue to run those in, continuing on from the lines that we've previously set. Getting thinner, getting smaller, getting brighter. You can see how effective this is already. I mean, it already looks nice. It just needs to be refined more at this stage. Starting to catch the lower edge now. I don't like to do too much of an edge highlight at the bottom of a cape like this, but I think a little bit just helps define that point where the cape ends, and I do think that's a good thing to do. Now just dotting in the last couple of really bright highlights. Super, super bright there. And just another tiny amount of edge highlight. And a super, super bright final highlight. There we have it. Just decided to come in and just dot a couple more, just tiny, tiny super highlights. Wasn't quite happy with the brightness there, so decided to just work it up one more level. It should be, when you're painting like this, a constant process of adjustment, stepping back from the piece, deciding if you're happy, coming in and making changes. The miniature is not an unforgiving surface to paint on. You can correct things that you're not happy with, and you don't have to consider them mistakes. The last section now, we're going to use some contrast black Templar loaded into the airbrush. And this is a great paint to use with an airbrush if you just add a little bit of thinner to it as well. You can get these really nice, smooth, dark transitions. You can see here I'm just using that to smooth out my gradients a little bit. And it just takes them from being fairly smooth to really smooth with very, very little extra effort. Popping a little bit in on the front there as well, just around the sides of the power armour. And then here's the reveal. This is where we got to after today's session. Apologies for the little wobble on the background there. It was a very windy day when I recorded this, and my studio it's pretty good at keeping wind out, but every now and again a gust will come in, and the wind was so continuous I didn't get a chance to actually record again, so I had to use this footage. But I think our guy looks pretty good at this stage. Alright, so we did a lot of work today, and this is probably one of the slower sections of the whole thing. The non-metallic was probably the slowest, but this is definitely one of the more difficult sections. However, we are now through the vast bulk of the work. We've got very, very little to finish on our guy. So looking at him, what I can see now is I'd like to do some freehand, I'd like to do some battle damage, and his little accessories, his eye lenses, the bones that hang around the little thing in his belt, the scroll on his belt, the purity seals, that kind of stuff. Those all need painting in. So freehand, battle damage, a bit of weathering, and his little accessories. That's probably going to be enough to fit into one more episode. Maybe two. We'll see. We'll see as I get to editing the last of the footage down. But hopefully you'll have enjoyed what we went over today. That little sparkly pattern that I show on the power sword, that's actually not how I typically do them. I normally do sort of little diagonal slashes down the blade with my highlights so as to kind of give that metal reflective comic booky kind of look. But I wanted to show you something a little bit different for this, so hopefully you enjoyed that as well. Do join me for the next one, folks, and please do remember to like the video and hit subscribe, and get at me in those comments if there's anything at all you want to ask ask relating to what we've gone over today. Always more than happy to answer your questions. Thank you, as always, so much for your support, and I'll see you folks in the next one.